Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast with Jayson Gee, the associate head basketball coach at Winthrop University, is brought to you by Compassion International. For $38 a month, you can release a child from poverty. It's as simple as that, providing food, education, and medical care, along with vocational training, all being done in Jesus' name. The most trusted child development ministry in the world is Compassion International, and they provide a great opportunity for both you and I to get involved and release a child from poverty. The website, compassion.com/sportspectrum. Compassion.com/sportspectrum. Check it out. Sponsor a child today and release a child from poverty. I promise you, you won't regret it. Today on the podcast, we welcome Jayson Gee to the program. He is the associate head basketball coach at Winthrop University. He was the former head coach at Longwood University from 2014 to 2018 and the former head coach at the University of Charleston from 1996 to 2003, and has a 202 and 175 record in his head coaching career. His assistant head coaching stops included Youngstown State, Ohio University, St. Bonaventure, and Cleveland State. In 2015, Gee was named the Fellowship of Christian Athletes John Lotz Barnabas Award, and he's also the author of the book, The Battle for Brandon, and that's the story of Gee's son's courageous fight against child onset paranoid schizophrenia. And we spend a lot of time in this podcast hearing Jayson Gee's story of his son, Brandon. We also talk a little March Madness with him and just what this time of year is like being in college basketball at the Division I level and being around March Madness. We also talk about balancing that whole idea of being a coach and being able to be not only a man of faith, but a man in the household and a leader in the household with your family. Difficult balance for so many. And for Gee, he's figured it out, making sure that his family and his faith are his priority and still being able to be an effective coach, an effective communicator, and an effective teacher of the game of basketball. So let's get to it. Great story here. Love talking to Jayson Gee, the associate head basketball coach at Winthrop University, here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Jayson, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Excited to be on.
Absolutely. Great to talk to you. And let's start with just the madness that is March. We're taping this, we're airing this in March 2019. You've been around college basketball a long time. What is it that makes March Madness as special as it is? I guess I'll just ask it in a generic sense, and you can take it from there.
I think it started off with Cinderella stories. I think the Cinderella stories made it the media and community and national interest type story that it's become. You know, the Villanova-Georgetown game, the Cleveland State run years ago that when they beat Indiana and got to the Sweet 16, George Mason, you know, those stories, you know, 16 versus 1, first ever upset last year. I mean, those things and the potential of those things transpiring just, I think, bring an interest level that's difficult to duplicate.
It really is. And it makes, you know, the casual fan too, because you guys have been playing since October, November, practicing, getting ready for this season. And then just the notoriety and the publicity just ratcheted up really right around this time. Do you see that even in some of the smaller programs that you've been a part of?
Absolutely. I mean, just our players understanding, you know, how serious and how special of a time this is. And, you know, when you coach at a tradition-rich program at Winthrop, where Greg Marshall went 8 times to the NCAA tournament, you know, not just your team, but the community at large is, you know, the expectations are, you know, March Madness. We got to get to the dance. So it's an exciting time.
Jayson Gee is our guest here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. At your press conference when you took the job back at Longwood, your previous job to where you are now, you talked about being called as a basketball coach. That was your calling. When did you begin to discover that calling?
Well, you know, I was struggling as a high school athlete and had a coach that that led me to the Lord. And I had a severe weight problem and was teased profusely, and he kept me on the team because he said I was a good kid. And that year, I became stat man because I would be so into the games that my teammates would ask me what their stats were at the end of the game. And then at the conclusion of that season, he made a commitment to work with me if I was willing to work with him. And the first day I showed up for a 6:30 a.m. workout, he told me about Jesus. And I went from 252 pounds as a high school sophomore to 230 pounds. I went from not getting to play on the JV team to be the second leading scorer on the varsity team, and later the next year led the team to the number one ranking in the state of Ohio, a big school division, and earned a college scholarship. So certainly me getting to know Christ and his impact and influence on me, led me to turn my life around. And obviously with him being a phenomenal, impactful role model that helped me be who I am and gave me that motivation to want to be a coach, and realizing the skills and the gifts that God gave me, were affiliated with impacting young men the way I was impacted.
So was coaching something that came right out of your time at high school and you knew you wanted to do it, or was that something that took a little longer?
Everybody told me because I could talk, I was going to be a lawyer. And, I went home my sophomore year, had been working out with my high school team, and my coach had asked me to put them through some drills at my high school that I had done in college. And then that Friday night, he says, "Hey, you want to sit on the bench?" And I'm sitting on the bench during the game, and I start making substitutions, and he was listening to me. And I didn't realize how disrespectful I was being to the varsity assistant and the JV coach, but he gave me an inch and I took a yard, and I felt a high that day. I'd never been high, never drank, never smoked, but I realized that high was something special. And at the conclusion of that game, I can remember saying, I can't wait to get back to school and declare my major. And I was going to coach in high school, and I was going to major in education, which I did. And that was really the exclamation point that gave me the confirmation that's what God wanted me to do.
Take us back to the first college coaching job you ever had, how it came about, and maybe just some thoughts, what was kind of going through your mind, that first time you ever coached in a college basketball game.
Well, I started out as a graduate assistant or volunteer assistant at Ohio University for Larry Hunter, who we lost this past summer. I was there, and I remember the first responsibility he gave me was he had told all the coaches he wanted one coach to do recruiting, one coach to work on camp, one coach to work on summer school. And when he got down to me, he says, "Go find the janitor and clean the boards here." And I was like, "Oh wow, I came here to be a Division I coach. What are you doing?" Very humbling. And then, ironically, a guy named Jim Clemens, who used to coach at Youngstown State, became the assistant coach with the Chicago Bulls because he was good friends with Phil Jackson. And they promoted in August. I got to Ohio University in June, and in August they promoted John Stroyer, who was still there on staff as an assistant. His best friend was the assistant at Ohio University that had left Youngstown to come to Ohio University, and I was living with him at the time, sleeping on his couch, working at Taco Bell at night, and he called and said, "Hey, you need to help me find an assistant. It's August." And he introduced us, and at 23 years old, I became one of the youngest Division I assistant coaches in the country. So an unbelievable door that God opened for me and got me started in my coaching career. And, coaching at the Division I level at 23, I thought, man, this stuff is easy. I've since learned after 30 years what a marvelous miracle that the Lord provided for me.
You talk a lot about the Lord, and you talked about being led to the Lord in high school. Tell me about the foundation of your faith in terms of how it kept forming as you got older, maybe some struggles along the way. Nobody's faith is perfect. Nobody's faith walk is one that we just, get on this high and keep going. It requires a lot of sacrifice, and it often brings struggles through that foundation of your faith in Christ. Tell us about that.
Well, first of all, I was a drug baby. I was drugged to church every Sunday. My dad did that, and it wasn't optional. I sat and I played and had no idea about a relationship until my high school coach Jim Scobie told me about Jesus and a relationship with Jesus, and then obviously with fame and stardom of falling in love with myself, despite the fact I was outwardly professing Christ. Right. I just got absorbed with the culture and the success that my basketball talents and the status, I guess I would say, that my basketball talents brought me, I took a dip in the world with 2 feet. And the greatest blessing I had was January 6, 1986, at around 6:06, I met my wife, who was a high school student. I was a sophomore in college, and we were just hanging out at our gym where her high school played their home games during Christmas break, because we had nothing to do as college basketball players. And she walks in, and the rest is history. We got married 4 years later, but her challenging me to my faith, and her saying to me, "What are you doing tomorrow on Saturday night?" and me joking and saying, "I'm going to Bedside Baptist," and everybody in the room laughed, and she walked out. And her challenging me to standards that no woman or nobody had challenged me to, particularly since my conversion, and understanding that I didn't lose Christ. Once you're saved, you're sealed. You're just a sinner who needs to repent and be transparent and return from your wicked ways. And so she had a lot to do with that. And had some rocky times of just unfortunate circumstances that have transpired, obviously with my son. But I would have to say the doubting stages, the falling off the wagon stages, I think my wife helped me get back on the path that I'm literally on today, and since that time have continued to grow closer to the Lord.
You mentioned your son, Brandon, and I know you have more than one child, right? You have multiple kids?
Yes.
Yeah, and Brandon is the one, though, that I'd like to talk about, because you wrote a book on Brandon. The book's called The Battle for Brandon, and it's the story of his courageous fight against child onset paranoid schizophrenia. I'm not even sure what that entails, to be quite honest with you. So why don't you just tell our audience, tell me about Brandon and the story that's detailed in the book?
Well, schizophrenia is a mental disorder condition that, where someone is, seeing things and hearing voices, and to get it at 11 years old is just a real unique situation. I think the numbers were 1 in 30 million that someone at 11 years old could have it at the extent that Brandon had it. It was really unfortunate, and the diagnosis was that he would be in day treatment facilities and hospitals for the rest of his life. And I think where the story began is I just, said no, that God had clearly told me he was going to be healed. I just didn't know when. And I knew or believed that the Lord was saying to me that I needed to behave as if he was going to be healed. That if someone broke their arm, they'd be in a cast, and for a day or two we would feel sorry for them, and then we would say, okay, you got to get up and start rehabbing. But we would all know that cast was coming off someday. And that's sort of the attitude that I took, and, saw him every day, which was not prescribed by the doctors. And it was an hour and 30-some minute drive, and mostly 2-lane road. And obviously leaving 2 other children, or 1 children initially at home, was not something that most people thought was intelligent. But the Lord had clearly called me to believe, walk, talk, and act as if he was going to be healed. And eventually he was. And thank the Lord, and we're still enjoying the benefits of that.
How challenging is that? I mean, and maybe take us through some of as much as you want to share. Obviously, you wrote a book about it, but take us through some of the sort of difficult moments just being a parent and walking through that together with your wife and obviously your other children.
It's amazing what transpired once the story came out, because when I read the book and proofread the book, and when I saw the documentary, I probably did a poor job as a father ministering to my wife and children. I was so determined for him to be healed. I exposed them to dangers they didn't need to be exposed to. I had to fight my son 4 or 5 times. We called the police 3 or 4 times. It was just a traumatic event, dealing with him in that condition. But again, I believed that God wanted me to treat him that way and check him out of the hospital for weekend visits or hours at a time. And my father, my family was scared of him. His younger brother, who was 11 at the time, and 9 at the time, and then we had a newborn child who was born, I want to say 4 months into his condition. And you know, when I heard the documentary and hear my wife say I was scared, I didn't want him to come home. I'd even prayed that the Lord would take him because he was going through so much pain.
Yeah.
He had gone in at 144, and within a year he was 244 and got as high as 302 pounds. And he was 6'2". He was difficult to deal with even as a 12 and 13-year-old. And I can give you one experience. I had checked him out, which was against the doctor's orders. I just fought him and basically intimidated him, if I'm honest, to allow me to check him out. And we went to go get a pair of shoes, and they didn't have his size, and it frustrated him. And he walks out of the mall and starts running from me, and I'm going, oh, good, but what am I going to do? So I caught up to him, and we fought there in the parking lot, and eventually was able to talk him into getting in the car. You know, most of these visits that I went on a daily basis lasted from 3 to 5 minutes, and he would eventually either hit me, start cussing, or just lose his temper, and I would leave. And so checking him out didn't sound like the logical thing to do, but I thought it was the logical thing to do if you believe he's going to be healed. And so I got him back in the car. We're about 20 minutes from the hospital to take him back to this psych ward, and I could hear his mouth almost, you know, like he's getting ready to spit. And he eventually spits right in my face, and he says, "I hate you." And I looked at him and said, "I love you." And he spat on me again, and this time he rubbed it into my arm, and he says, "I hate you." And I looked at him again and told him, "I love you." We had about 4 or 5 exchanges. I'm a little hard-headed and prideful, and I was going to get the last "I love you."
Right.
And he eventually stopped, and those are the kind of experiences we had for 3 years until he came out of this condition.
During this time, you're also coaching still, right? You're in the college basketball coaching profession, right? Trying to navigate both of those worlds.
Yes, it was a challenge, and thank the Lord for the coaches I worked with, starting with Anthony Solomon at St. Bonaventure. And then, you know, me leaving every day, I would go in the morning and get some things done, and then I would go see him, and then I would come back and prepare for practice, and sometimes go back that evening with other people. And you know, and after about 3 or 4 weeks of this, I really felt bad and met with the staff and told them I'd be more than happy to resign, but that I was going to go keep seeing my son.
Right.
And that God had told me that I needed to treat him as if he was going to be healed, and if that was causing a problem. And they were phenomenal. They felt like I was getting just as much done, if not more, and obviously supported me. And then I've got a spiritual mentor a guy by the name of Gary Waters, who became the head coach at Cleveland State.
Yeah.
And the Cleveland Clinic and the University Hospitals is known for great medicine and care. And I felt led to be with him, and I left Bonaventure, you know, at the height of his illness, and went to Cleveland. And I really think that move was a faith move, and despite the fact it didn't work out like we had planned, we had thought we were going to have all these medical professionals. Cleveland Clinic was full, University Hospital was full, and they referred us to a doctor who had just started in this field dealing with children. And most doctors can go their entire professional life and never deal with someone as bad as Brandon with onset schizophrenia at 11 years old. And we didn't realize it, but God had provided this doctor because she was willing to go through a therapy that was being tested at the National Research Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. And that therapy was the miracle that brought my son out of the condition he was in. And unbeknownst to us, God had really ordered our steps to actually accept the unknown and the less likely, and all the while it was the likely.
So what was the greatest lesson you learned through this whole process? And we'll talk about in just a second how Brandon is doing now, but what was the greatest lesson that you learned, whether it was from God or just from a human perspective, of walking through this entire process with your son?
You know, Jason, what was interesting, I learned a prescription that I call the prescription to the supernatural. And that prescription I give to my players, I give in speaking engagements now, I give to everybody that'll listen. And it's my 5 pillars. It's my core value set now, just applying those things to Brandon. And I think the faith in God and faith in his word. He said he's the great physician. He's a healer. Love for God, love for your son, love for what you do and what you're called to do. Submission. You got to submit to the word of God. You got to submit to authority. Discipline. I had to increase my discipline, my quiet time, just my self-discipline, my eating habits, the temple. And then hard work, which is the essence of an athlete. You got to work hard. And those are the 5 intangibles that I now call a prescription. And I call it prescription because when you have a cold, you can get over-the-counter medicine. But when you're really sick, you need a prescription. And I call it the prescription to the supernatural. And I gained those 5 intangibles, and I applied those to these situations. And 3 years later, my son walks out of the hospital. And so certainly I believe and have learned those things from that.
Yeah, that's tremendous. How is Brandon doing now? Why don't you give us an update on how he's doing? How old is he, by the way, now?
He will be 26 March 22nd.
Okay.
He is doing well. He is in college. He's at York Technical Community College. He is probably doing as well as he's done in a long time because he's just excited about being in school, being faithful with that. He volunteers with the parking ministry at church. He's a part of a men's group. He's a phenomenal big brother because I got a 13-year-old daughter, and with my travel and my wife's travel, he's oftentimes the head of the household.
Sure.
But he's doing extremely well. We're just so thankful to have him back among us and a part of it. And he's really thankful that his story has led to countless people being saved, and we've just tipped the iceberg with the story of the battle for Brandon.
Amen. I was just going to ask you what his thoughts were when he heard about a book being written in terms of his story and what he thought maybe when he read it.
His initial thoughts were, this is for me, Dad. Wow. He went through a time. This is mostly before the book. He went through a time that he was like, "Why me, God?" Which is very normal.
Yeah.
And he came out of that time. He just got a revelation. He called us crying one day. My wife and I were on a trip together, and we were obviously nervous with what had all transpired in his life, and he couldn't even talk. And he goes, I get it now. I get it now. God has revealed it to me. The enemy tried to take me out. This story has to be told. And then obviously the Lord's provided a platform for that story to be told, and we certainly are thankful because of it.
That's awesome. A couple more questions here with Jayson Gee, the associate head basketball coach at Winthrop University. Tell us about now in life as a coach at Winthrop, and really I think one of the great struggles in coaching, and you kind of mentioned this with Brandon started taking over the head of the household, is that balance and staying connected with your family and trying to also be a college basketball coach as well. What does that look like for you right now?
Well, it's awesome. I think one reason is, I've got a unbelievable queen of 28 years. It'll be 29 May 5th, and we do marriage ministry together. So, instead of, separating at that time, which a lot of parents that have special needs child and health issues like we had, they do. They separate, and it brought us closer, and we've been able to minister to people, with that experience, and we're thankful. And my wife played college basketball at North Carolina A&T, which certainly helped her understand the essence of college basketball. And it's helped us, have a platform and continue to minister to each other as well as others.
So at this point in your life, what is the Lord teaching you right now, Jayson? This will be our final question. It's one we ask to all of our guests. So what is God teaching you right now in this season of life? What's the biggest lesson the Lord has impressed upon you?
Well, he's just reaffirmed that I'm headed to third. I'm about to round third, headed home in my career here. I'm 53 now. I've been doing this 30 years. But I think what he's really impressed upon me is this issue of serving, this issue of gratitude, of how thankful we should be no matter what lot we're in or stage we're in or circumstances. And I think thirdly, I think he's shown me, with the experience, that how to serve others and how to pour into them and remind myself and my family members and those that I influence that it's only for a season. So whether this trial you're going through, understand you're going to come out on top, and it's a training ground, not a complaining ground. And God doesn't deny our destiny, but he'll delay it according to our obedience. And that's what this experience and these gray hairs have taught me over the years, and I'm thankful for it.
He is Jayson Gee, associate head basketball coach at Winthrop University, and really this has been awesome to get to know you, Coach, and I hope to get to shake your hand in person someday, and really grateful for you to share your story here on the podcast. Thanks so much.
Jason, thank you.
Many thanks to Jayson Gee, the associate head basketball coach at Winthrop University, for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast, and thanks to his courage, not only his courage to tell his story of his son Brandon here on the podcast, but for writing the book, The Battle for Brandon. It's available on Amazon. You can check it out. Order that book, The Battle for Brandon, the story of his son's courageous fight against child onset paranoid schizophrenia, and just thankful that he's willing to share his story so he can help others. Grateful that Brandon is doing well too, 26 years old on March 22nd, and excited for the future for him and for the entire Gee family, including Jayson Gee, whose prescription to the supernatural was just awesome. That was probably one of my favorite parts of the podcast, when he talked about faith, love, submission, discipline, hard work, and why it's called a prescription, because we all need a prescription when it comes to our faith, and not just some kind of Band-Aid over something that we're going through. We need a prescription. When we need some help from a doctor, when we need serious medicine, man, we get a prescription. And so really good stuff there by Jayson Gee, the associate head basketball coach at Winthrop University. Many thanks to him, and many thanks to Compassion International for sponsoring this podcast. $38 a month, provides food, education, medical care, and vocational training. Releasing a child from poverty, that we don't take that lightly, and Compassion International certainly doesn't as well. Check out the website, compassion.com/sportspectrum, compassion.com/sportspectrum. See why over 2 million children are being released from poverty through the great work being done with Compassion International. Make that difference in a child's life and go and sponsor them today. Again, the website, compassion.com/sportspectrum, and release a child from poverty. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast with Jayson Gee. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, social media, everywhere at sports_spectrum. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we have lots of video content on there, including every single podcast that we've ever done here at Sports Spectrum. Just click that subscribe button at YouTube. You can also go to our website. That's where all of our content is found, at sportspectrum.com, including a daily devotional every single day at 6 a.m., as well as content every single day, articles on the intersection of sports and of faith. Check it out, sportspectrum.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. I hope you have a great rest of your day.